Hey, everybody. Welcome to the TrailBlazers podcast. We're your hosts, Tyler and Dave. And Tyler, on today's episode, do you mind giving us a bit of an intro on our guest?
Sure. On today's episode, we had Mia Au. She is a mechanical engineer from the University of Alberta. Afterwards, she took her master's at the TRIUMF lab in Vancouver. And now she's currently doing her PhD studies at the Large Hadron Collider in CERN, at CERN in Geneva, Switzerland. So that's where she is right now. A really interesting story. She talks about, the curiosity she had for physics and the drive to kind of go deeper into that field and learn new things. So I think anybody that's kind of curious about following a path similar to that and getting deep technical knowledge and experience in a specific domain that makes you curious will get a lot out of this episode today. It was really interesting. So Dave, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, that's some kind of good introduction, Tyler. And I think, one of the words that you used that I also kind of picked up was just like curiosity. Mia was talking about basically her initial point of time when she went and got her first co-op internship job at TRIUMF in Vancouver. And she kind of just mentioned and shared the story about how she was the only person getting interviewed from the University of Alberta. And just kind of curious about getting into something that she didn't really know, which I felt really cool. And, I can kind of share based on some of my experience at this point. I really appreciate somebody, who's willing to kind of go and jump out of their comfort zone. As well, a couple other things that she mentioned that I thought were quite interesting is how she talked about when we're living in somewhere that maybe say isn't our native language, how maybe say empathy and understanding and communication can be quite important because we're trying to meet people, on their level or even just halfway, right? So I really appreciate kind of her touching on, when we're not in our home or native environment, really having to think about, how would I see this if I'm in their shoes kind of approach. So I think that was quite interesting and just a really cool story. I really enjoyed listening to her talk about some of the technical concepts, and we got to ask her a couple questions about some of the technical concepts and things she's researching right now. So I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. So without further ado, here we go.
Over to Mia.
If you wanted to, Mia, maybe you could just walk us through a little bit about what a typical day-to-day looks like right now for you. And then from there, we might start asking you more questions about your journey to this point and your path and everything.
Sure. Yeah. The typical day-to-day can vary wildly. So sometimes we run experiments. So I guess people know quite a bit about CERN in terms of the LHC, the Large Hadron Collider, which is the gigantic accelerator that goes across the border between Switzerland and France. But what people don't know so much are the various stages that the protons take before they enter the LHC. So they start from a multi-accelerator system and they go up various energy scales before they're actually at the energy of the LHC. And along the way, you have all these different experiments that take protons from the accelerators at different energies. And I'm working at an experiment called Isolde, which actually takes about half the protons at CERN and mostly studies nuclear physics. So when we run beam time, it's called time when the proton beam is running. There are all these different projects kind of competing for the beam. So people will write proposals and say, here, we really want to study this thing. Here's why we can only do it at a radioactive ion beam facility. So can we come to your place and study it? And we have all this list of proposals, and they kind of go through a committee where people say, this is a good physics case, this is impossible, maybe we should try this one later. And you get this schedule of beam time. And if you're on the technical team, like I am, your job is to help make the beams that then get delivered to the experiments. So depending on the experiment, it could be more or less intense. So sometimes it's 16-hour days at work, and then you run home, get a quick sleep, come back in the next day. And other times it's everything's working fine. I'm just going to do my 9 to 5 and then go home.
Very cool. Very cool. So then what do your kind of day-to-day activities look like to get the beam up and running? Because I know you're also a mechanical engineer because we had classes together and stuff. So
I don't know what to say. Yeah, it's hard to say. Most of the people in my group are not quite engineers, not quite chemists, not quite physicists, kind of all three.
Interesting.
It's a nice mix. But I'm in the targets team, which means we sort of design and build and test the thing that the proton beam hits to then cause fission and fragmentation and spallation, which then makes all these radioactive products. And then you have to sort of sort through these with a variety of methods to get out the one that the experiment wants. So sometimes this is making uranium carbide, and then you shoot the protons onto it and basically create the entire nuclear chart all across the periodic table, all the isotopes. And then you have to somehow deliver this to the experiment in the way that they want to measure it. And so we do a lot of offline developments. So we've got a lab where we test the targets and the different technologies sort of offline. And then we have the online facility where the proton beam actually is. And there we do things like checking to make sure the beam you want is coming out at the right rate and what parameters you need to tweak to get it to work properly.
All right, I have a bit of a follow-up question to this. So from like a technical level, I'm sure this is like very deep technical wise. I'm kind of wondering, so you started as a mechanical engineer and then you did Eng Phys for your master's. Is that correct? Am I wrong? Or?
Yeah, so UBC has an applied sciences program. Okay. So it's a master's in applied sciences. And basically the one in engineering physics goes underneath the physics department. So it's not in engineering, it's in the physics department. And there are almost no differences between that and the MSc in physics, except for, I think, 2 courses that are different.
Got it. Okay. So my question is something like this, because you clearly have like a very deep technical skill set. I'm kind of wondering, is that like, do you mind walking us through this process of like how at each point of the process you kind of like were developing your technical skills and kind of maybe any tricks that you found to say like kind of accumulate these skills in like a faster way to really like understand the overall technical objectives that you're working on within your PhD now?
I guess developing the technical skills must have started in mechanical engineering. Although when I went into mechanical engineering, I have to say I never thought I would end up doing nuclear physics at CERN. It was just kind of like a point A to point B was not visible when I was at point A. But I did a co-op term at TRIUMF, which is a particle accelerator in Vancouver. So sometime during the mechanical engineering degree, I think it was in 3rd year, I did a co-op term in Vancouver at this accelerator, and I was like, wow, this is really cool. I really like physics. And just kind of being there and being on the job, you start to pick up a lot of technical skills because it's just a job. You have to do it. Somebody says, well, we have to make this work. And you go, well, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3, how do we make this work? And then I got really interested in physics. So the people around me were doing physics. There was a lot of stuff going on at the lab. I guess you can imagine a mechanical engineering 3rd year student going to a particle accelerator for the first time. Like, what is all this stuff? And all the new stuff that I hadn't really picked up in school in mechanical engineering, it was mostly physics. So I started taking a few physics classes, and I actually did the mathematics minor. So the mechanical engineering degree, you could take like a few extra classes and pick up a math minor on the side. So I did that. And that kind of opened up the way to going into the physics masters. So I kind of identified like, physics is the thing that I'm missing to do the things that I'm really interested in working on. How do I go there? And then did the physics masters. And one thing led to another, and I ended up at CERN.
Very cool. And I would be wondering about, because I think there's always a dilemma for students whether they should take a master's degree or not. Do I do graduate studies? Do I go into industry? Looking back on it now, it was the right decision for you. How do you evaluate that decision? What do you think are some important factors? And should a person decide to maybe go get some experience first and then come back and get a master's degree, or go straight into a master's? Kind of maybe walk us through that thought process that you had at the time. And then from a master's to a PhD, that's something that even less people do. So maybe you could touch on that as well.
One thing just before I kind of dive into that is that it does seem to be different in different countries. So here in Europe, it seems way more common to do a master's degree. People just kind of by default do it. And the PhD is also quite a bit more common. So I think it might be more of a Canada, maybe North America specific thing, that the master's is a little bit of a bigger step. But I remember during the undergrad, there was never really like a definitive time where I decided I really want to do a master's. It was just that I never really felt done learning. So I guess the biggest thing I would say is don't do a master's if you don't think you can commit 2 years to a project that you might not be interested in, because it does take a while. It takes a lot of work, and I think you really have to be invested and interested. And I do know a lot of friends who probably could do a master's and have chosen not to just because they don't feel interested in the topic enough to spend 2 years of their life really diving down into that one topic. And I think that's completely respectable. It kind of comes down to how interested you are and how much you really care about finding out that tiny little piece of knowledge that nobody's really gotten to yet in that one little area. And that's what it is, I guess. You just specialize so far that you become the expert in something, but it does mean you kind of miss out on other things as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think to like, you know, kind of like what you're mentioning, first of all, with say like it being a bit of different on the country basis, is I agree with that too. Cause like I previously was in China and now in Singapore, and in China, it was almost like the de facto is that basically after your bachelor's, if you have the opportunity to go get a master's or get a PhD, you pretty much go and get a PhD or a master's. And then I noticed that too, talking with a lot of my friends from Europe who are now based in Singapore as well. I think that the one benefit, for example, is like if you're in the UK, it's like a 3-year bachelor's, and then I believe like a 4-year PhD. So, you know, for example, say us in Canada, if we chose the co-op route, you know, it's 5 years bachelor's off the bat. And then if you want to do a master's, another 2 to 2.5, and then, you know, a PhD afterwards. So it takes quite a while. And then I kind of have a question for you in regards to say like choosing like a very specific topic to go into technically versus say like getting more of a broad skill set. Because I know for say like a PhD or a master's, it's really good to be kind of focused on like a single topic. And then perhaps in like a working environment, like it might be good to kind of be able to spread yourself, but be kind of like a master of maybe one or two. So for your work so far during your PhD, have you found it to be like very beneficial, say going like really deep in one specific area? And would you also maybe talk a bit on like the pros and cons of that too? Maybe say like based on your experience, say going really deep in like one particular area of research versus say maybe being a bit broader in some other ones.
Yeah, I would actually say that compared to a lot of people in my field, I'm not actually that specific. So I think one thing I've noticed is that every time I like step towards a new field, you just discover people who have gone farther in that field, and all of a sudden you're a generalist again. So what I was saying before about how most of my research group is kind of not quite engineers, not quite chemists, not quite physicists, some sort of thing in between, is that you really do need to pull ideas from more specialized groups in all those fields. So in some ways it's a bit more specific in that most mechanical engineers don't end up working with something like radiation, and basically my entire job is about radiation. But in other ways, once you're in the field, you can definitely find ways to specialize more or less. And I think that when you go a bit more theoretical, so some of the students I'm working with in the physics experimental groups, they do their entire PhD on one experiment, which gives you one observable, which tells you one thing about a theory or a nucleus or something they can relate back to more fundamental principles. And I would say that that goes quite a bit deeper than sort of the work in the technical teams. So I think it really depends, because I'm sure if I took a step there, then I would again find out that there are definitely more things to specialize in. It's kind of the beauty of the field, and also I think why I couldn't step out of it, that there's always more to learn.
It's interesting. Yeah, there's always ways you can go deeper into some field, I guess. And then I'm wondering, I think there's always those skills that come with you, though, no matter kind of where you go. So I'm wondering, you say you work in technical teams. I know at the U of A you were in the aero team for a number of years. Right. Yeah. So I was wondering what maybe
have some similarities, eh?
Yeah, the student vehicle projects. So I was wondering, were there some skills there, maybe team dynamics, interpersonal skills, communication skills, or otherwise that you picked up that's helping you in your career now? And would you advocate for students getting involved in side projects like that while they're at university?
Totally. I would say the vast majority of the students I worked with in the student vehicle projects had a positive experience. I guess there's a few instances where it makes sense to sort of balance your workload. But I think if you have the time and your work-life balance allows for it, then I would say definitely go for the student vehicle projects. You make friends, first of all. You learn to have fun solving problems, and then like the process to getting the right answer can actually be really fun. And even if you don't get the right answer, you still learn a lot along the way. I think that's really valuable, as well as just picking up like skills that you need to do basic tasks, I guess, like basic coding, machining, hands-on experience. Like you don't really pick the skills if you don't try them in the first place. I mean, we all have to be bad at something, so I feel like you might as well start early and start from there.
Totally. I think like, okay, even just first touching on like the thing that you're just talking about, like we all need to be like bad at something, right? Is, I don't think I mentioned this with Tyler yet, but I was like talking with another friend and they're trying to kind of find like a really perfect way to like basically like transition jobs. And then like at each like point we're kind of talking and they're like, okay, like next month it's kind of like they're still at the same spot. And it's just like, if you just like start now and you apply now, then you'll like have this like quicker like iterative loop to then give you like the feedback you need to like identify like the things that you're bad on, right? So like I agree, it's like the earlier you can start that process as like a student or a young professional, it's going to help a lot. And then, okay, one thing I was like curious on too, say with regards to actually when you originally decided to go to Vancouver and go to the accelerator there for like your very first co-op job, I'm wondering, was there like any influence from like, say the, like basically the group that you're a part of at the University of Alberta, like did that kind of inspire you in some senses to kind of like search out that co-op opportunity, or like what really kind of just like inspired you to go get that job? Because I think like for most of the students at the University of Alberta, I think you're probably the first student that I know, like say from when my time there, like afterwards, that kind of like found like a really, or like a unique opportunity like that. So I'm kind of curious, like what really like kind of stoked you to go and find that co-op opportunity at that point in time?
I think so. The co-op office definitely made it easier because they had this sort of list of all the jobs and all their descriptions, and we were all just kind of like crawling through this list of jobs all the time trying to find one that was interesting. And I think out of all of them, that one just really stuck out as something that I didn't know. Like the first time I read the job description, it was about designing a target system and an electron to gamma converter. And I was reading this and I was like, what's an electron to gamma converter? How do you design something like this? And I remember, I think I was the only one from the U of A that got the interview. And I remember being a little bit freaked out when they posted the, you know how they post those slots of the interviews and they say,
yeah,
there's somebody has a slot here, somebody has a slot here. And there was just one. I was like, okay, here we go. It's that time.
You're like the forehead sweat beads are like slightly rolling down.
Yeah. And then it was a Skype interview because they're in Vancouver. So they didn't come into the co-op office or anything. So I was sitting here in this little room and they were holding up like cross sections to the camera saying, do you know what this is? And I was kind of going, I can't hear you. Is your microphone on? This was before Zoom and this Riverside thing were a thing. So it was just it was a Skype call or something. No, sorry, I have the diagram upside down. How's it look now? So it was really fun. And I think it was the chance of learning a lot that I didn't know that really appealed to me. A lot of the other jobs felt kind of safe, I guess. Like, oh, I feel like I could do that. I feel like that would be fine. And I think that's also what turned a lot of the engineers in our cohort off of this job at TRIUMF, was that there was this feeling like, what if I just can't do this? What if I have no idea how to make an electron to gamma converter? And I think for me that was exciting and kind of what drew me to it. And for other people it was like, better not apply.
Interesting. And yeah, just to add on to that, there's like another factor there with that it's not even in Edmonton, like you had to move away from home, right? So I feel like that makes the fear and the anxiety of that possibility all the more worse. Like, what if I move all the way from home and then I can't build this thing? And then that's even worse because I can't even like, go home and cry about it if I need to, right? Like, so I know I had that feeling when I left and went to the Netherlands too. I was just like, what if I can't do this job? And then I'm not even in Canada. But what I would want to ask you is, you've done that for your master's now, and now you've gone to Switzerland for your PhD. What are some takeaways you have from being an expat or from moving away from home or continually moving for new opportunities? And, what sticks out to you about these locations and some experiences that you've had that you might not have otherwise if you had stayed and pursued a career in Edmonton?
I think one thing is just thinking in a different way. I mean, the language barrier is part of it, that I really think when people use a different language, they actually like process thought in a different way. And you really have to rethink the way you communicate and the way you act around people to sort of come to their level. And I think if you stay in a place where the default behavior is something that you've just always taken as a given, you never really learn to kind of meet people halfway. And I think it can be really good for empathy to put yourself in the place where you're like, I have no idea what's going on and I'm just going to depend on everyone around me to help. So I think it's really good and kind of humbling actually to just realize we don't know anything and there is no one right way to be. And I think that was a really valuable lesson as well, just seeing how people do things in different places.
Yeah, for sure. Like, speaking a little bit on my journey too, I'll just kind of touch on that because I think it's like one of my biggest lessons of living away from Canada too is like when I first moved to China, I started learning Chinese because like, first of all, it's like I realized like if I wanted to live in China and like actually like understand the people and the culture, like I needed to, like what you're saying, basically like meet people halfway rather than thinking from like my perspective all the time, like try to find like that common perspective or some common ground. And then I found that actually like once I had learned Chinese and then like I relocated to Singapore, it was like the same thing as like, because you couldn't actually, I heard this really good quote one time, just like in second languages, but I think it's like any type of communication is like, if you can speak like a second language to somebody and it's their native language, like you can actually like touch them in the heart essentially like with like how you're communicating because like you're trying to find that common ground and kind of trying to touch them on like that empathetic level. And so with that being said, I actually kind of want to touch back on like the last question that we asked before, the one about moving. I'm kind of curious, like, were there any points of your life that you sort of realized that you just had this like natural appetite to take a little bit more risk or kind of like search out the unknown? Because I think, to some extent, like it's always nice to kind of have like that safety net, like that blanket and, be like, oh, if Tyler, we can't design a satellite or whatever, I can still go back and like be in my safety net. But, like, was there like any moment in particular that you realized you're like, hey, I'm just going to go and do this and like see what happens? Or do you think that was more of like an inherent trait that maybe you had learned for like many years growing up?
I don't know. I don't know if I would say that it's an appetite for the unknown, although I would say I do like new experiences. They're fun. But I would almost say it's more like being afraid to fail, I think, can hold you back a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you just kind of make peace with the fact that you're not going to be good at everything you try, things become a lot less scary to try. And I think a lot of people kind of get wrapped up in this sort of perfectionism where if I do it, I'm going to have to make sure I don't do it wrong. And I would say that in a lot of cases, just doing it is better than not doing it at all. So, maybe it's something slightly different.
And no,
you just have to get comfortable with failing, I think.
For sure, yeah.
I think that's a really good point. And I always hear that we've had a few people tell me, well, Dave's told me, I don't have a graduate degree, but we've been told by another one of our guests that a master's degree is a crucible for resilience and kind of knowing how to withstand failure. And that person also had a PhD. And so I was wondering, in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of challenges with telelearning. And we know that the engineering degree is hard, graduate studies is hard, even more so now when there's so much disconnect. I'm sure you've faced plenty of adversity, like you said, getting comfortable with failing throughout your graduate studies. Maybe if you can share, maybe if you had some adversity in your graduate studies and what you would say to students now that are having a tough time, in their undergrad, trying to get their degree, what would your advice be?
Yeah, totally. I guess in terms of adversity, I think when you switch fields, you definitely have to be ready to do some extra work, because when you move from one sort of foundation of knowledge to a place that expects you to have a different foundation of knowledge, you have to either acquire it or sort of learn how to transfer over quite quickly. And so I noticed that when I started the master's in physics, and I started right away with graduate level quantum mechanics. And I was like, this is great. In the first class, they were like, so in your first 2 classes in quantum mechanics, and I was like, what first 2 classes in quantum mechanics? Where are we going now? And so that class was a bit abysmal, but I learned a lot and really fast. And I have to thank a lot of friends for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, okay, that experience sounds like identical to me starting my master's degree. I remember my master's degree, like my very first class. I took 3 classes my first semester. My very first one was the theory, control theory, which basically is just like the theory behind linear algebra, essentially. And like, because I did chemical engineering, we hadn't been learning math for already like 3 years at that point in time. And I had basically like, I was one of those chemical engineers at the beginning. I was like, oh, I'm never going to need math for like my entire career or anything like that. I'm just going to shelf this behind me. And then like, it was like master's, like psych, like here's modern control theory. And then after that, I was like, psych, I'm doing machine learning as like a professional career now. So like the math just like came
back to get you.
Yeah, it's like, okay. And now apparently every day I need to use math in order to like, make a living. I was like, oh, isn't this like a little ironic, that thing that I shelved like 3 years prior to my master's?
Just to add on my own two little tidbits to this
Sure.
one, I'm having that same experience right now because at work, CSA, we're building a quantum communication satellite, and so it works with like quantum entanglement and everything like that, and just stuff I never ever paid attention to or never found not interesting. But in my undergrad, I was like, I'll never need to know this, and now I'm like one of the guys on the project, and I'm just like, oh man, like it would have been really helpful if I explored this a little more early on. But that's life, right?
Yeah, and watch them.
Yeah.
Sorry,
I think those are great moments too, when you put yourself in a place where you're like, well, now I'm the person who really needs to know this. So
yeah,
somehow it's very motivational for learning.
Yeah, it's like as soon as you kind of have the like the gas that from under you or whatever, then it's like, okay, it's time to like get moving. Okay, this leads me into one of my next questions, and that's kind of like a personal why. So like I'd say even for myself, like when I was a bachelor student, like I really kind of was like not so particularly sure like what that why was. Maybe when I was like hitting like year 4, year 5, I was like, okay, data analytics seems cool. I'm not really sure where I want to go with this yet, but I like using data to do some type of like predictive modeling. And then like, I think through time, like that became more clear to me, but I'm kind of curious for you, Mia, is like, did there kind of be a time, like at any point, say like master's, PhD, bachelor's, where you sort of thought through, like what that why was for you? And then I'm kind of curious now, maybe if you had some time to reflect on that, like, do you have any advice for say like current students or young professionals to kind of think through that why for themselves?
I think that's a really hard one because it's so different for everybody. And I think the way that people get to their answer is really different. I think the way that I fell into academia was that it always just seemed that sort of the pursuit of knowledge kind of thing was a general good. And I think everybody sort of has this feeling that they want to do good in the world. At least I think that's a motivating factor for a lot of people. And I think until you really go into a subject, it's really hard to say exactly how it connects to doing good for the world. So you can do your little project, maybe like a capstone project, and not really know how it connects to helping society or making something useful. And I think there's also like factors that are a bit more personal, like people are looking for a salary that lets them live a certain way, or looking for a family. And sometimes that kind of, I wouldn't say conflicts with, but it can definitely push interests in a different way, just to sort of prioritize a lifestyle rather than a topic that you focus on in one aspect of your life that might be work. So, I don't know. For me, it was definitely feeling both personally curious, like I do genuinely want to know more about this topic, and also feeling that the results will eventually be useful somehow. Although at the time I didn't know how. I just kind of hoped that somehow it would help. And I think I'm still kind of there. Like when you have to write a grant application, the very first thing you have to think about is, why should people care about this? So every time you ask for money to do a project, you have to think about, okay, why should people care about this? And then you have to put it down on paper. So I think that sort of helped clarify it for me. And I know that in applying for a lot of degree programs, you sort of have to do the same thing. You have to say, here are my interests, here's why I find them interesting. And I think even now at the bachelor's level, some programs ask you for sort of a like list of interests or like intention in applying for the program kind of thing. And I think that's actually helpful for people to just put it down on paper. So maybe if students are thinking about it, they can think about the things they're interested in and think why people should care. And it might sort of stand out to them as why they care.
Very interesting. And so that makes me really curious. So with the work you're doing, I think we can all agree that the work happening at CERN is incredibly important, and will help a lot of people. But what, like specifically for you, what are you writing those proposals? Why would you say that your work is important and benefits others?
So my work specifically is part of this LISA program, which stands for Laser Ionization and Spectroscopy of the Actinides, which is an EU-funded project to understand the heaviest elements. And often, like, I don't know if you guys remember the periodic table, you know, there's those two lines that are at the bottom, sort of separate from all the other ones. The actinides are the bottom line. So the ones that are just kind of like hidden out of the way, where people are like, we don't really know much about those. And one of the problems is that they're almost all radioactive. So they're also a little bit challenging to talk about societally now because of nuclear technology. So it definitely has a certain connotation when you talk about it in the public. And it's only started to become feasible to do in research. So a lot of the properties of these elements are not known, and even less the properties when they bind with other elements. So the properties of actinide molecules are often just missing. And they have a lot of implications in our theoretical understanding. So the electronic configuration in the actinides gives them specific properties that are very difficult to predict theoretically. And a lot of the theories are just kind of out there waiting for the experimental results to happen. So once we get those experimental results, I think it leads to a lot more understanding in a bunch of different fields. And then there's sort of the individual application of each actinide or each isotope. So there's the big one right now is actinium-225, which is an isotope of actinium that has a series of alpha decays with a half-life that makes it particularly useful for nuclear medicine. And there have been a couple studies recently on the effect of using it as radiotherapy. So sort of basically you would attach this radioactive thing to a biomolecule and send this biomolecule to a tumor where it then kind of decays explosively and destroys the tumor. And there have been some very successful looking case studies, and now there's quite a push to figure out how to actually make more of this extremely rare, non-naturally occurring isotope. And so that's just one isotope out of the vast many in the actinide series.
Very interesting. Okay, I'm curious. So basically at the stages of research where it's at right now, is it like we don't really know maybe a lot of the use cases that could occur from basically some of the elements that you're researching at this particular point in time? Or like, are there kind of already, say, like some research or ideas or hypotheses of like how these could be used? And then, you know, maybe they're kind of trying to see if like this is can we actualize on this? Or is it really just like right now it's figuring like, okay, if we go and do this research, then we're going to have more solid understanding of basically like how these elements and their isotopes work. You know, do you mind maybe talking a little bit about that? I'm kind of curious from like the technical aspect now.
Yeah, I think for some physics cases, it's quite clear. Like, if we were able to measure this one thing, we would know the answer to this one question. And for things like the actinium, it's quite clear. If we were able to make a lot of it, here's exactly what we could do with it. And for others, it's like we don't even know enough about this particular thing to say why it would be useful, because we don't know what it does. And it's sort of the case with the actinide molecules, is that we don't know a lot about actinide molecules except for the very stable ones that you often find in nuclear fuel, for example. And recently there was a paper published about radium fluoride, and radium is a radioactive element, and monofluoride, so it's one radium atom and one fluorine atom binding together. And here at Isolde, they did laser spectroscopy of it. And from this, you can get quite a bit of information. But doing it at a radioactive ion beam facility lets you take even more information out of it. Potentially, we don't exactly know. They were able to do it in that one case. Maybe we're able to do it in other cases. That's sort of part of the project. Yeah.
Interesting. And then so when you wrap up your PhD, I'm sure as you do a PhD, even more questions come up, kind of things you'd probably like to explore and learn more about.
Totally.
What do you think would be next for you? Would you want to stay where you are working at CERN? Oh God, sorry. Did I ask an existential question?
It's a hard question.
Actually, we're changing our podcast into an interview now. Would you like to come on as a postdoctoral researcher?
Undercover CERN interview. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's really hard because, especially when you work at a lab like CERN, you start to run into considerations of there aren't that many places in the world that do this kind of research. So you really have to think about which out of the maybe 5 cities, where would you want to end up if you stay in this field? And I think a lot of people in the field ask this question, and I might be in a slightly different position having come from this mechanical engineering background where it opens up a whole sort of side door of possibilities that might not happen if you had been very focused on getting the spin of one particular isotope kind of thing. So I'm not sure. I guess the sort of the deflecting answer is we'll see when we get there.
We'll have to have like a part 2 in like, I don't know, maybe like 1 or 2 years time and then be like, all right, like, how do you like
where did
decide?
Mia end up in the end? Yeah, who knows?
Exactly.
I'd like to know too.
I'm kind of curious from something we touched on earlier, since you're living in Switzerland now, which language have you decided to learn there? Because I know that's like, it's like French, German.
Yeah, so in Geneva,
Italian,
it's French.
Okay.
It's completely surrounded by France. Like we have a French border to the south, to the west, and the north.
Okay,
so a lot of people in Geneva speak English. So I've been very privileged in that most people meet me more than halfway. But I'm trying to learn French. I did an A1 French class. It was good.
Nice. Yeah, it's a difficult language. I know I have to learn it right now for my work and being in Montreal and everything. Yeah, so I'm nearly 2 years in, and it gets easier. Not really. There's always more things to learn and everything like that. I think Dave knows. Dave's been learning Chinese for a few years now. But yeah, no, it's an exciting journey. I think at the same time, like you were mentioning earlier. So well worth it, especially if you plan on continuing to be an expat and looking and living in a place where English isn't everyone's first language, right?
Yeah. Although I think people who do have English as their first language are particularly lucky. It does seem to be spoken by a lot of people, more so than other languages. Mm-hmm. And I would say that at work, I still predominantly use English.
Right on. That's a huge advantage. Well, Mia, we could talk to you for a long time, but I think we're going to kind of maybe wrap up there. But just before we go, I would wonder if you have any parting advice or counsel or words of wisdom for anybody that's in university right now, trying to figure out what they want to do. Maybe they see you working at CERN and they want to do that one day, or they just have no idea what they want to do. What message would you give for them?
I don't know if I'm in the best position to be offering words of wisdom, but I don't know. I guess maybe to touch back on what you said before about it being a difficult time for telelearning. I was TAing at UBC during the start of COVID, and I know it was really hard for a lot of the undergraduate students with the shift to not being at campus. They can't do their homework with their friends. They have to sort of organize an email or a call in order to get office hours or help or something like this. And I think I would just say to all the students who are still students out there, like, you're doing amazing if you're still in it, because it's super hard. Mm-hmm. But I think all the faculty is behind you on this one. So stick it out. I hope it gets better.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would second that. I don't know how people are doing like an engineering degree right now in teleworking. I think we all had enough struggles like in regular times. It's sad to see. But yeah, just like you were saying, just persevere. Everybody's behind you. We all feel for you. So yeah, but anyway, thank you, Mia. That was wonderful. You gave a lot of good advice and kind of highlighted a career path that is incredibly interesting that I wouldn't know how to get. And I'm sure a lot of people will get a lot out of it. So thank you for coming on today.
Yeah, man.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Totally. And I'll just throw in my thanks too. Yeah, thanks so much. If Tyler and I are ever in Switzerland, I will sure let you know, and I'd be happy to meet for a coffee and talk a little bit more. I mean, as much as I tried to brush off a lot of those chemical engineering things, like they're still on there, and I'd love to keep learning more about those. So thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, definitely let me know if you two are around. I technically have guide training now, at least for Isolde, so I can take you in to see the experiments.
Hey.
Okay, everyone, that was Mia. Hope you enjoyed it. I certainly learned a lot during that one. I definitely don't study particle physics that often, so some of the things she was saying kind of went over my head a little bit, but she gave a really good explanation of the work that she's doing there and why we should care about it. I didn't really know that the work they did there had some medical applications that are, quite, that, are kind of really worth pursuing, and, it's quite interesting. So I definitely learned a lot there. I liked her personal views on some things too. Like she was a big proponent of, you need to be able, you can't be afraid of failure. You have to be bad at something. You have to be bad at something before you can be good at something. So for somebody that, if you just look at her path, she's doing a PhD at CERN. If I just looked at that at the high level, I'd be like, this person never fails anything. They get everything right all the time, 4.0s, everything like that. They don't know what failure is, but clearly that's not the case. Mia was saying that that's really a critical component of your journey and being able to pursue different opportunities at the same time. So I really liked the advice that she gave. And as well as the little anecdotes along the way to help support the advice that she was giving. And Dave, what did you think?
Yeah, really well put, Tyler. I think, one of the first things she touches on is basically some of the technical concepts. So like Tyler's, you're mentioning, Tyler, you didn't take your, a lot of physics classes. Hey, but I think that like Mia was able to explain a lot of these concepts in, like layman terms. So it was really fun. And like, I kind of wanted to kind of dig a little bit deeper, like, especially as the episode went along. So we'll have to, kind of go and learn a little bit more. Hopefully can have like a part 2 in the near distant future. One thing that I really like too is talking about like perfectionism. One thing she mentions is like, you can't be perfect at like everything, right? And like Tyler, you talked about that too just a second ago is, you're going to not be great at some certain things. And like, we just need to accept that, right? Like, and as well too, like one other thing that she mentioned, and I've seen in my master's and as well as my technical work is you'll always kind of find people who are more deep than you in like one specific area, right? Like it's just natural. There's so many talented people in this world that are very curious and like want to learn and be experts at the content that they're great at. And I think it's just like almost a mentality shift is like, it's actually not like a position of competitiveness, but it's like, how can we collaborate together? And then maybe like I can learn this from you and maybe I can teach you something that you're not so familiar with. So I felt like just like her attitude towards like curiosity and learning and growth is like extremely positive and definitely something that any of us can kind of learn from going forward. So yeah, Tyler, any other thoughts or what do you think about that?
No, I think you summarized most of it really well. I think the one takeaway that I'm going to have from this one though is kind of what you mentioned in the intro and what she said during the episode is I never really thought of it that way, that, going to a different place and learning a new language really increases empathy levels a lot, right? Like I know that it's done that for me quite a bit, but I've never really just, explicitly had that thought. And so that was really helpful for me too. And, she kind of advocated for that as well. If you go to a different place, you'll kind of have some of that experience. So yeah, like you were mentioning, really deep on the technical stuff, but also more on the personal side as well of exploring and being curious about going to a new place. So I think, she's definitely getting both sides of the coin there. And it was a really enjoyable interview. So I hope you guys enjoyed it too. Make sure you like and subscribe, leave a comment, give Dave and I some feedback if you want to see particular people on the show. If you want us to touch on certain topics, stuff like that, don't be afraid. Shoot us a message. And we hope you guys have a good one, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.